The last message from Earth did not arrive with fanfare or drama. It slipped into the comms arrays of the outer colonies like a whisper in a storm, faint, broken, and almost missed entirely. A technician on Luna Prime, working the night shift alone, was the first to catch it. At first, he thought it was interference, the usual static that danced between planets. But then he heard it, a human voice, cracked with exhaustion, speaking words that would soon echo across the entire human diaspora. This is Geneva Accords Command. Earth Orbital Network. Signing off. Atmosphere compromised. Oceans rising toxicity. Major population centers. Offline. We are sending everything we have. Our stories. Our music. The faces of our children. Do not let us be forgotten. The transmission carried more than words. It carried data terabytes of it. Family photographs. Recordings of rain on rooftops. A child's laughter caught on a phone camera. The final sunset over the Pacific, filmed by an automated satellite as the sky turned the color of rust. For 3 minutes and 17 seconds, the signal held. Then it dissolved into white noise. And then, nothing. No more pings from Earth satellites. No more chatter from ground stations. Just silence where a planet's heartbeat used to be. Across the colonies, people gathered around screens. They watched the footage on loop. They listened to that final voice until the words lost meaning and became pure feeling, a grief too large to name. On Mars Colony Theta, workers in the hydroponic farms stood motionless, hands still buried in soil, tears cutting clean paths through the red dust on their cheeks. In the cramped corridors of Ceres Station, strangers hugged without speaking. Everyone understood the same terrible truth. The cradle was empty. The place where every human had been born for 2 million years had gone quiet. The grief moves differently in different hearts. For some, it was a weight that bent them double. For others, it became something harder, something sharper. The leaders of the off-world settlements began meeting in private chambers, their faces lit by soft blue screens. They spoke of practical realities. They used words like sustainability and resource allocation. They did not say the word funeral, but that was what they were planning. Not for people, for an idea. The idea of Earth as home. Weeks passed. Then months. The colonies kept spinning. Oxygen recyclers hummed. Food synthesizers produced their bland but nourishing paste. Children born on Mars took their first steps in low gravity, their bones forming differently than any human before them. Life continued, because life does. But a change had settled over the settlements, a quiet shift in how people spoke about the past. Earth was no longer home, it became the lost world. A cautionary tale. A beautiful, fragile mistake. Some tried to hold on. An old botanist on Luna spent her retirement trying to grow an oak sapling in a sealed chamber, using soil samples brought up decades earlier. She talked to it every day. She played recordings of wind through leaves. The sapling died after 6 months, its roots unable to find purchase in the artificial dirt. She buried it in a small metal box and never spoke of it again. Others turned away completely. They argued that Earth's fall was inevitable, that humanity had been too emotional, too divided, too attached to old ways of living. They pointed to the colony's orderly systems, their clean energy grids, their controlled populations. We survived because we evolved, they said. Earth clung to sentiment. Sentiment does not power life support. By the 3rd year of silence, a new generation was growing up who had never known blue skies or felt rain on their skin. To them, Earth was a story parents told at bedtime, a place of impossible beauty and impossible danger. They learned about oceans from textbooks. They saw forests only in archived videos. And slowly, without anyone deciding it outright, the mourning began to fade. Not because the pain lessened, but because survival demanded attention elsewhere. There were crops to tend, systems to maintain, new laws to write for people born under artificial suns. Yet in quiet moments, the loss still surfaced. A worker on an asteroid mining rig would pause during his shift, staring out at the star-flecked blackness, and wonder if any birds still sang down there. A teacher on Mars would catch herself describing summer to her students. Then stop, because how do you explain warmth that comes from a sky, not a heater? These small fractures in daily life were the true markers of what had been lost. Not the planet itself, but the thousand tiny experiences that made it home. And so humanity drifted, not just through space, but away from itself. The colonies grew more efficient, more controlled, more careful. They built walls not just against vacuum and radiation, but against messiness, against unpredictability, against the kind of beautiful, chaotic love that had once made humans plant gardens in war zones and write poetry during plagues. They called it progress. They called it wisdom. They did not yet know that in the frozen dark beyond Pluto, 10 ships slept. That inside them, 200,000 hearts beat slowly in cryochambers. That libraries of memory, real, unfiltered, gloriously imperfect human memory, were preserved not in databanks, but in the minds of dreamers waiting to wake. They did not know that Earth's final broadcast had been received not just by colonies, but by those ships, and that its last words, "Do not let us be forgotten," had become a vow. But that knowledge would come later. For now, in the fragile bubbles of metal and glass scattered across the solar system, humanity learned to live without a mother. And in learning that, they began to forget what it meant to be her children. They did not see the fleet coming. How could they? They had already decided the story was over. They did not realize some stories refuse to end, even when the world goes silent. 4 years after Earth fell silent, something new began to grow in the colonies. Not hope, but order. The scattered settlements on the moon years passed. The silence from Earth became normal, like a missing tooth you stopped noticing after a while. People got used to living without it. But absence leaves a shape, and over time, that shape filled with something else. Control. On Ceres Station, the floating hub between Mars and the asteroid belt, a new kind of order took root. It wasn't loud or violent. It didn't need to be. It came wrapped in promises of safety, efficiency, and survival. After all, they'd watched Earth burn itself out with too much freedom, too many voices shouting at once, too many choices. Chaos, the leaders called it. And chaos, they said, was a luxury humanity could no longer afford. Meetings happened behind thick glass doors. Decisions were made by small groups who claimed to speak for everyone. They weren't cruel, not exactly. They just believed that feelings got in the way of good planning. So they built systems. Systems to manage food rations, to assign jobs, to decide who got medical care and who didn't. Even birth permits were controlled now. Too many people, they warned, and the air recyclers might fail. Too few, and the colonies couldn't grow. Everything had to be balanced like numbers on a screen. Life became quiet, predictable, safe in a cold sort of way. Children learned logic before poetry. Art was allowed, but only if it served a purpose, like calming workers during long shifts. Music had to be approved. Stories couldn't show rebellion or sadness that lasted too long. We can't afford despair, the education module said. Hope must be useful. Most people accepted it, not because they loved it, but because they were tired. Tired of loss. Tired of uncertainty. After Earth fell, survival felt like enough. Who had energy to fight for messy things like fairness or dreams? But not everyone stayed quiet. In the lower decks of Ceres, where the vents hummed louder and the lights flickered more often, whispers moved through the corridors like ghosts. Workers traded old Earth songs on smuggled data chips. A baker saved extra flour to make real bread once a month thence. Warm, smelling of yeast, and shared slices with neighbors who remembered their grandmothers doing the same. These weren't acts of war, just tiny rebellions of memory. Small ways of saying, we were more than this. Still, the council grew stronger. They called themselves the Off-World Assembly, now a name that sounded official, permanent. They wore simple gray uniforms, spoke in calm tones, and always had data to back up their rules. Emotion clouds judgment, their leader once said during a public broadcast. We honor Earth by learning from its mistakes. And so, on a cold February morning in 2053, they gathered in the Grand Chamber, a wide, circular room with walls made of polished asteroid metal. Sunlight, filtered through solar mirrors, fell in clean lines across the floor. No dust, no clutter, just order. They had come to mark an ending. For days, preparations had been made. Holographic displays showed ruined cities, New York half swallowed by vines, Mumbai underwater, Paris silent under snow that never melted. These images weren't shown with sorrow, but with solemn finality. Like closing a book whose story had run its course, chairs were arranged in perfect circles. Drinks were served nutrient-balanced, flavor-neutral. Someone had even composed a short piece of music, slow, steady, without a single sharp note. It played softly as the delegates arrived. When everyone was seated, the lead speaker stood. No fanfare, no applause, just a nod. Today, they said, voice smooth as glass, we acknowledge the end of Earth's era. For 2 million years, humanity began there. But evolution demands change. We are no longer those people. We are clearer, stronger, wiser. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Some wiped their eyes, not from grief, but from relief. Relief that the guilt was finally being put to rest. That they could move forward without looking back. Then came the toast. Clear liquid in clear glasses. They raised them high. To the future, the speaker said. To survival, another added. To order, said a third. They drank. The moment felt heavy, sacred almost. Like they were burying a ghost. Outside the chamber, in the service tunnels and maintenance bays, ordinary people paused their work. They'd heard about the ceremony. Some felt uneasy. Others felt nothing at all. One young cleaner, wiping down a console near the comms array, glanced at the live feed on a side screen. She saw the neat rows of gray uniforms, the calm faces, the empty glasses now set down in perfect alignment. She thought of her grandmother's voice, how she used to sing lullabies in a language no one spoke anymore. She thought of the taste of real strawberries, which she'd only read about. She thought of real wind, not the recycled breeze from ventilation fans. She didn't say anything, just turned off the screen and went back to work. But in that same moment, far beyond the orbit of Neptune, deep in the icy dark where sunlight barely reaches, something stirred. 10 ships long silent, long hidden began to wake. Their engines hummed to life, not with a roar but with a low, steady pulse. Lights blinked on inside cabins where people had slept for nearly a decade. Computers unscrambled ancient star maps. Navigation systems locked on to Sol, not as a distant point of light, but as home. The Off-World Council didn't know any of this. How could they? They had declared the story over. They had toasted to a future without ghosts. But ghosts, it turned out, don't always stay buried. And sometimes they return with libraries full of songs, seeds, and stories. And a simple message. We remember. The celebration on Ceres lasted less than an hour. By the time it ended, the first signal from the returning fleet was already slicing through the void, silent, fast, and unstoppable. The council had closed one chapter. They didn't realize another was about to begin. The signal reached them in the deep quiet, where even time seemed to slow down. Out past Neptune, Past the last flicker of sunlight, 10 ships floated like seeds in an endless winter. Inside, 200,000 people slept not in coffins or tubes, but in soft chambers where their bodies rested while their minds drifted through carefully crafted dreams. They dreamed of green hills, of rain on skin, of voices calling their names across open fields. The dreams were not random. They were memories, preserved, protected. Years earlier, when Earth's government still had fragments of power left, they'd launched these ships in secret. Not as an escape, but as an ark. A promise. While the world burned below, rockets carried families, artists, teachers, farmers, engineers, ordinary people with extraordinary hope into the silent dark. They carried more than supplies. They carried soil from 1,000 gardens, seeds wrapped in cloth, recordings of birds at dawn, handwritten letters, recipes for bread and soup and birthday cake. They carried the messy, beautiful weight of what it meant to be human, not just the science and the strength, but the songs and the sorrows too. For 8 years, the fleet drifted, silent, hidden, their engines cold, their presence unknown even to the colonies they'd left behind. The plan was simple. Wait until the worst had passed. Wait until Earth could breathe again. Then return, rebuild, remember. But waiting is a strange kind of suffering. In the dream chambers, time stretched and bent. A child might dream an entire childhood in what was, outside, only a few months. An old man might relive his wedding day 100 times, each time noticing a new detail, the scent of his wife's hair, the tremble in his own hands as he slipped the ring onto her finger. They weren't frozen. They were living inside memory, keeping it warm like embers under ash. Then came the signal. It pierced the fleet's shielding, not as an alarm, but as a whisper. Earth's final broadcast, delayed by distance and distortion, finally catching up to them after years of travel through empty space. In the command center, where a skeleton crew of awake guardians monitored the long sleep, screens flickered to life. A voice, broken but clear, filled the room. Do not let us be forgotten. The guardians didn't speak. They just listened. And when the transmission ended, one of them reached out and played it again. And again. Until the words were carved into their bones. They made the decision quickly. No debates. No committees. Just a shared understanding that settled over them like dawn. It was time to wake the sleepers. Time to go home. The awakening began gently. First, the dream shifted. The green hills grew sharper. The rain felt colder. Voices calling from fields became clearer, closer. Then came subtle cues, a breeze where there had been stillness, the smell of damp earth after a storm. The sleepers' minds prepared before their bodies did, easing them back toward reality like a hand guiding someone from a deep sleep. Then the chambers warmed. Soft light bloomed behind their eyelids. Heartbeats, slowed for years, began to quicken. Lungs drew deeper breaths. Fingers twitched. Eyelids fluttered. A woman opened her eyes. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just stared at the curved ceiling above her, remembering where she was, remembering why she was here. Then she sat up slowly, muscles stiff but alive. Around her, others were waking too, stretching, blinking, touching their own faces as if to confirm they were still real. No panic. No confusion. Just a deep, quiet knowing. They had slept so their memories wouldn't die. And now they were awake because those memories were needed. In the corridors, people moved with purpose. Not rushing, but flowing like water finding its path. Parents found their children. Lovers found each other's hands. Strangers exchanged small nods, a silent agreement passing between them. We remember. We carry it. We go back. The ships hummed to life around them. Lights brightened. Engines warmed from cold silence into a low, steady vibration that traveled through the decks and into the solace of their feet. It felt like a heartbeat, like coming alive. On the bridge, the Guardians watched as navigation systems plotted a course, not toward empty space, but toward the inner system. Toward Earth. Toward the colonies that had forgotten. One Guardian, an older man with lines around his eyes from years of watching stars, placed a hand on the console. He thought of his granddaughter, who had been 6 when they left. She'd asked him, the night before launch, if he would remember her favorite story, the one about the fox who learned to love the moon. He'd promised he would. And in his dreams, he had told it to her 1,000 times. Now he whispered to the empty room, "We're coming home." The fleet turned as one. 10 ships, moving together like a flock of birds after a long migration. They gathered speed slowly, gracefully, their engines pushing against the void. Behind them, the Ur cloud faded into darkness. Ahead, a single bright point of light grew steadily larger. Saw their sun, their star. They did not know what they would find. They did not know that at this very moment, leaders on Ceres Station were raising glasses to Earth's memory, believing the story had ended. They did not know they were about to step into a world that had tried to forget them, but they carried what mattered. Not weapons, not threats, just the truth of what had been lost and the stubborn, unbreakable hope that it could be found again. As the ships cut through the dock, a child on one of the lower decks pressed her face against the viewport. She'd been born just before launch. Earth was only a story to her. But now, staring at that growing point of light, she felt something pull inside her chest, a longing she couldn't name yet. Her mother came and stood beside her, hand on her shoulder. "Is that it?" the child asked. "That's our star," her mother said softly. "And somewhere close to it is home." The fleet moved on, silent, certain, carrying 200,000 heartbeats and all the memories the universe had tried to erase. The first sign was a flicker on a sensor screen deep in Ceres Station's monitoring bay. A junior technician saw it and frowned. Just a glitch, he thought. Space was full of noise, cosmic rays, dust particles, old satellite debris. He almost dismissed it. But the flicker didn't fade. It grew, multiplied, became 10 distinct signatures, moving together with impossible precision. His fingers froze over the keyboard. His breath caught. He called his supervisor. Within minutes, the quiet hum of the station changed. Alarms didn't blare. This wasn't an attack, but a low, urgent chime spread through the corridors. People looked up from their work. Something was happening. On the Grand Chamber's main display, the celebration was still winding down. Glasses had been set aside. Delegates were rising from their seats, exchanging quiet words about the future. Then the screen behind them shifted without warning. The images of ruined Earth vanished. In their place appeared 10 small, steady lights approaching fast. A hush fell over the room. Not fear, not yet. Just confusion. Like waking suddenly in a strange room and not knowing how you got there. Then the comms channel opened. No explosion. No threat. Just a voice, calm, weathered, human, filling every speaker on the station, in every colony within range. "We are the children of Earth," it said. "We do not come to conquer. We come to remember." And then they showed them what they carried. Screens across Ceres lit up with images no one had seen in years. Not ruins, not death, life. A child's hands pressing into wet clay. An old man playing a violin on a sunlit porch. Rain falling on a forest canopy. Droplets catching the light like scattered diamonds. The smell of bread baking in a wood-fired oven somehow translated into data and beamed across space. The sound of waves rolling onto a shore at dusk. A mother singing a lullaby in a language that hadn't been spoken aloud since Earth fell silent. People stopped moving. A woman carrying a tray of nutrient packs stood frozen in a hallway, tears streaming down her face as she watched a video of dandelion seeds floating on a breeze. A maintenance worker leaned against a wall, watching footage of a crowded market, people laughing, arguing, bargaining over fruit so ordinary, so alive, it felt like a punch to the chest. These weren't historical records. They were moments. Small, sacred, unimportant moments that Earth had made room for. Moments the colonies had forgotten how to have. In the grand chamber, the delegates sat back down. No one spoke. The leader of the council stared at the screen as a simple animation played, a seed pushing through dark soil toward light. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly on the table, because the truth was dawning on everyone at once. Earth hadn't just died. It had lived, right up to the end, and its children had carried that life with them into the dark. The fleet kept coming. Not aggressive, not demanding, just present. Like a memory you've buried suddenly standing in front of you, whole and breathing. On Mars Colony Theta, workers in the farms dropped their tools. They gathered around shared screens, watching as the broadcast showed something impossible. Real soil. Rich, dark, alive with worms and roots. One farmer reached down and touched the sterile gel his crops grew in. He thought of his daughter, born on Mars, who had never felt dirt under her fingernails. He began to cry, not from sadness, but from a sudden, fierce longing for something he'd never known. He was missing in the lower decks of Ceres, where life was hardest. The reaction was different. People didn't cry. They got quiet. Then they started moving. A group of miners gathered near the central hub. A baker handed out real bread hoarded for special occasions to strangers. Someone started humming an old Earth tune. Others joined in, voices rough but sure. It wasn't a protest. It was a homecoming. For the first time in years, people looked at each other not as workers or residents or resources, but as fellow humans who had lost the same mother. The council tried to respond. They sent a formal message, calm, measured, asking for identification and purpose. The fleet replied instantly, but not with data or demands. They sent a library, not of weapon specs or political manifestos, but of poetry, of recipes, of bedtime stories, of wedding vows spoken in 100 languages, of 1,000 ways humans had found to say I love you across time and distance. And with it came one simple question, broadcast to every human being within range. What will you carry forward? That question did what weapons never could. It slipped past defenses. It found the cracks in people's hearts, the places where they still kept small secret longings for more than survival. For beauty, for messiances, for the right to be sad sometimes, or joyful without reason, or to plant a garden just because it felt good. Security officers on Ceres found themselves hesitating when ordered to prepare defensive positions. How do you aim weapons at people showing you videos of your own childhood planet breathing, laughing, living? How do you treat as enemies those who carry the last recordings of birdsong? By the time the fleet settled into a gentle orbit around Ceres, not too close, not threatening, just near enough to be seen with the naked eye, something had already shifted. The story the council had built over years, brick by careful brick, was crumbling. Not from force, but from memory. From the unbearable weight of what had been lost and what had been saved. People stepped onto observation decks and looked up. There, hanging in the black, were 10 ships small against the stars, but glowing with soft light from within. Like lanterns, like promises, and for the first time since Earth fell silent, humanity felt something it had almost forgotten how to feel. Not just hope, but belonging. The deep, quiet certainty that they were not orphans after all. That somewhere out there, in those ships, were people who remembered how rain felt, who knew the weight of a hand held in darkness, who carried the embers of a world not to reignite an empire, but to warm, cold hands. The council still sat in their chamber, but the air had gone out of their celebration. The glasses remained on the table. No one touched them, because a toast to the future means nothing when the past arrives, not as a ghost, but as a living, breathing witness, and asks you gently, will you remember with us? The change did not come with explosions or shouting. It came quietly, like dawn after a long night. In the days after the fleet arrived, something shifted in the air of the colonies, not the recycled air pumped through vents, but the feeling between people. Strangers looked at each other longer. Conversations started without purpose. A worker might ask another about their dreams. A child might be allowed to draw on a wall without being scolded. Small things. But after years of tight control, small things felt like revolutions. The council tried to hold its ground. They met behind closed doors, voices tight with worry. They spoke of security, of protocols, of maintaining order. But when they gave orders to restrict movement or shut down communications, the people hesitated. Security officers stood at their post, but didn't raise weapons. Technicians received commands to block the fleet's broadcasts, but left the channels open. No one refused outright. They just paused. And in that pause, something new grew. Within a week, the council had fractured. Some members disappeared into private quarters, unwilling to face what was happening. Others stepped forward, not with surrender, but with humility. They walked onto public decks and spoke without scripts. They admitted they had been afraid. Afraid of chaos. Afraid of loss. Afraid that without strict control, humanity would vanish like Earth had. And in admitting fear, they became human again. Not leaders. Not rulers. Just people who had tried to protect what they loved in the only way they knew how. From that broken ground, something new took root. Representatives from the fleet met with willing voices from the colonies, not the powerful, but the gardeners, the teachers, the cooks, the mechanics. People who understood that survival wasn't just about oxygen levels and calorie counts. It was about meaning, about memory, about the right to feel lost sometimes and to find your way back with help from others. Thought their first act together was simple. They took Earth's final message, the broken transmission that had traveled for years through empty space, and they played it again. Not as a relic, not as a tragedy, but as a promise kept. Across every screen, in every home, in every quiet corner where someone still carried grief, the voice returned, "Do not let us be forgotten." And this time, the reply came not in words, but in action. Ships began moving not toward Earth yet, but toward each other. Martian transports docked with Ceres freighters. Lunar shuttles carried supplies to asteroid habitats. People traveled between worlds not as officials or workers, but as neighbors. They brought gifts. A jar of real honey from a Mars greenhouse. A hand-knitted blanket from a Ceres artisan. A data chip filled with songs written in the dark years. They weren't rebuilding governments. They were rebuilding trust. Then came the harder work. The fleet shared what they carried, not just memories, but tools. Seeds that could grow in wounded soil. Microbes that could clean poisoned water. Techniques for healing land without forcing it into submission. Teams formed, some born on Earth, some born among the stars, and together they traveled home. Not to a paradise. Earth was still scarred. Rivers ran thick with silt. Forests stood as skeletons against gray skies. But it was breathing, and that was enough. The first garden was planted near what had once been Geneva. Not in a lab. Not in a sealed dome. In open air, under a sun that still felt strange to those who had only known artificial light. Hands some calloused from years of ship maintenance. Others soft from life in climate-controlled halls, dug into the earth together. They placed seeds into soil and covered them gently, like tucking children into bed. No one spoke much. But when the first green shoot broke through the dirt weeks later, a sound went up, not a cheer, but something softer. A collective breath. A recognition that life, once invited, always finds a way. Years passed. Not easily. There were setbacks. Storms that washed away young crops. Systems that failed. Moments when old fears returned and voices grew sharp again. But something had changed in humanity's bones. They had remembered that they were not meant to live in perfect, controlled bubbles. They were meant to live with dirt under their nails and uncertainty in their hearts, and hope that refused to die, even when everything else did. On the 10th anniversary of the fleet's return, people gathered on a shore that had once been choked with plastic and ash. Now, clean water lapped at sand where grasses grew. Children, some born on ships, some on Mars, some right here on healing Earth, ran barefoot along the edge of the lake, laughing at the cold shock of water on their skin. No one told them to be careful. No one timed their play. They were just children. Being children. Elders sat nearby on blankets, sharing food that had been grown in real soil. They didn't speak of politics or progress. They spoke of small things. The taste of the bread. The way the light hit the water at sunset. A bird that had returned to nest in a nearby tree, a real bird, with feathers and song and no purpose other than to live. No speeches were made. No monuments unveiled. Just presence. Just people, together, on the ground that had given them life twice, once at the beginning, and once again after they had almost lost it forever. Later, as stars emerged in a sky no longer hazy with smoke, a woman who had slept on one of the 10 ships for 8 long years stood at the water's edge. She dipped her fingers into the lake and let the cold water run over her skin. She thought of all they had carried through the dark. Not weapons, not power, but memories. And she understood then that memories are not heavy things to drag behind you. They are seeds. And when planted in willing ground, they grow into something new. The Council had celebrated Earth's fall because they believed the story was over. They had toasted to a future built on forgetting. But they had been wrong. The story was never over. It had only been waiting for hands to plant seeds, for voices to sing old songs, for hearts to remember that being human means carrying both sorrow and joy, and choosing, every day, to lean toward the light. And on that quiet shore, with water lapping gently and stars watching from above, humanity began again not as survivors, but as gardeners, tending what was broken, believing in what could grow. Knowing now that no world is ever truly lost as long as someone remembers how to come home.